Why is Russia struggling so much in Ukraine? That is a question I have seen asked again and again and again over the last few days, so I figured I'd have a go at answering it. Because I believe there to be three primary identifiable reasons: logistics, morale as well as training, and finally inflexible strategic planning. I'll be going into detail, of course, as to what precisely I mean with these terms and why I think they are the primary reasons, but before we get to that, let me set the scene here a little bit, because we need to understand the wider conflict first, militarily speaking, so I'll put on some Combat Mission Black Sea in the background for a bit of relevant entertainment, so to say. So, it appears to me that Russia was trying for a Western-style coordinated blitz. Mass strikes of air, artillery, and precision ordnance to scatter and decapitate the enemy, followed by air mobile elements to seize a vital infrastructure and link up with multiple swift-moving armored and mechanized columns, who would themselves have in turn already overwhelmed their immediate opposition with the weight of fire and ferocity of action. Any of this sounding familiar yet? It should, because it is pretty much the way of war as popularized in modern times by the United States of America. Shock and awe. Also known by its far less catchy official name, rapid dominance. The idea being to, in the words of Harlan Ullman and James Wade, to seize control of the environment and paralyze or so overload an adversary's perceptions and understandings of events that the enemy would be incapable of resistance at the tactical and strategic levels. Or, in layman's term, bomb the ever-living life shit out of the poor fucker over there until he is genuinely confused about what's up and what's down. It's an effective strategy, but a lot harder to pull off than it sounds. And in Russia's case, we saw on day one, or more correctly night one of the invasion, their attempt to decapitate the Ukrainian army with enormous rocket artillery and precision ordnance strikes against the usual strategic targets, command centers and airfields. Now these did achieve some success in that a considerable portion of the Ukrainian Air Force was caught on the ground. These strikes have also since been sustained through the following days, but appears to by and large have failed in disrupting Ukrainian leadership and have most certainly failed to break Ukrainian morale. Furthermore, Russia's apparently rather indiscriminate deployment of massed artillery has also turned practically the entire world against them. Not a good start. Which leads us to our first point for discussion: inflexible strategic planning. The Russian army appears to have made a series of erroneous assumptions about the war ahead of time, and have either refused to change their tactics and timetable or been unable to do so due to pressure from Moscow. This is best seen in the now repeated attempts on Kiev, which started with a rapid airborne assault on the Boryspil International Airport. Excuses to any Ukrainian or Russian viewers, I am undoubtedly going to fail at these names quite hard. But this is a fairly classic modern-day invasion tactic, where the aim is to seize control of the airport, and then use its long and wide runway to land heavier transport planes, with additional troops, supplies, and light armored vehicles. This airport is particularly noteworthy in that it is the place where the Antonov AN-225 is located, the largest aircraft ever built, making it an ideal landing strip for moving in absolute tons of supplies and reinforcements. It is, in theory, in fact, a very smart move that might have allowed Russia to encircle the west side of Kiev on day one, and possibly even blitz the city itself near immediately, hopefully seizing a significant portion of the Ukrainian political leadership whilst doing so. But Fierce resistance saw the attacker suffer casualties even in the initial blitz, as this would be no repeat of 2014, which is probably one of those erroneous assumptions made by the Russian High Command. After presumed heavy fighting, the Russian airborne special forces did take control of the airport, but were later ousted by a combined arms Ukrainian counterattack undertaken reportedly by the 4th Rapid Response Brigade. The precise damage inflicted to either side is a topic of much debate and fog of war, but it appears the Russian VDV were driven off the airport but maintained contact with the Ukrainian forces until being reinforced by further advanced air mobile elements coming down from Belorussia or being deployed via further helicopter transport maneuvers, and then the Russians retook the airport. At the time when I'm recording this, the Russians appear to be in control of the airport. But what's more interesting is that simultaneously with all of this, allegedly Russian Special Operations Forces had infiltrated Kiev and the surrounding area wearing Ukrainian uniforms. I add, again, allegedly, since this would be a war crime if this was ever proven, but they had supposedly attempted to take control and panic the city and the military, again, presumably in a bid to grab a hold of Kiev quickly. This does not appear to have succeeded, however, and at this point it should have been clear that the defenders were plenty willing and able to fight, even with the capacity to launch combined arms counterattacks. This makes the deployment of further, primarily light infantry forces deep behind enemy lines very, very risky. And yet, despite this, another airborne formation, reportedly the 76th Guard Air Assault Division, tried to take the second airport to the south of Kiev, the Vasyalkiv Air Base. The first stage of this attempt was allegedly, again, made by further special operatives dressed up in Ukrainian police uniforms. They attempted to take the airfield by storm, whilst the 76 Guards formations involved were approaching in IL-76 transports. This would seem to be a very bad idea, as these are massive planes, very easy to detect and relatively slow. They are exceptionally ill-suited to flying into contested airspace, and sending them into an area still being fought over with Ukrainian AA and AAA assets still active is a downright criminal waste of Russian lives, and 2 of them were supposedly shot down, with each one potentially carrying over 120 soldiers each. Reports then follow of heavy fighting in the area, with casualties in the hundreds reported, though very much again so unconfirmed, suggesting that elements of the 76 did make it down to the ground and into action with the Ukrainian forces. Eventually, these Russian troops were reported as destroyed or driven off. And if all of this is true, it would be a very strong indication that the Russian army was just doing what it had planned out to do, regardless of the situation on the ground, as trying to directly assault a defended airfield like this is unfathomably risky. This then leads us to our next possible reason, or more likely a combination of all the possible reasons: morale and training. Ever since the Second World War, when the Germans demonstrated it so very well, the focus of military operations had been moving away from great sweeping plans organized down to the tiniest detail by vast general staffs, and towards more localized initiatives by NCOs and officers on the ground, with the large sweeping plans seen more as general guidelines than a hard timetable or set of instructions. It is a sign of a poorly trained and organized army that it sticks to the larger plan even when the plan is clearly outdated by the facts on the ground. And this may be an explanation for why we not only saw the air assault, allegedly, but also why we seem to be seeing so many burnt out and destroyed Russian tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles. Modern-day anti-tank weaponry is very effective and small. One of the weapons reportedly used in Ukraine is the N-Law. This is the product of a British and Swedish cooperation that produced a light anti-tank guided missile, a one-shot disposable weapon. As you can see, it's not very big at all, and a soldier can easily move and hide whilst carrying it. But despite its small size, it's got a very good chance of knocking out even a modern main battle tank, and most IFVs and APCs would not stand a chance against it, much less trucks. Ukraine has also reportedly deployed the American-made Javelin, a weapon that makes an absolute mockery of nearly all current Russian armor. And the Ukrainian army is also expected to receive massive shipments of other light anti-tank weapons, like the Norwegian-produced refinement on the United States law, which we call the EC law. Again, these are very effective weapons which require a very specific response. There are, of course, countermeasures like explosive reactive armor or the more hyper-advanced and experimental arena system, but these are far from perfect, and usually the best countermeasure against such light anti-tank weapons is an effective and aggressive infantry screen. Armor by itself, you see, is a sitting duck, a big, noisy target with limited optics and visibility, particularly when it comes to spotting a single dude in camouflage clothing sitting half a kilometer away in a tree line aiming an anti-tank guided missile at them. But getting infantry to leave the perceived and highly treacherous, mind you, safety of their armored boxes is hard. And then, getting them to walk ahead of the seemingly invincible metal monsters that are the tanks, harder still. Obviously, it seems somewhat counterintuitive for the infantry to put their barely protected fleshy little bodies ahead of the 40 tons of space-age armored vehicles. Doing this effectively and aggressively in order to defend those ridiculously expensive and valuable tanks, APCs and IFVs takes a lot of on-the-ground training and discipline, along with personal initiative from the officers and the NCOs as to when to dismount to be safe and when to mount up and make good speed. And if the defenders play it smart, and there is every indication they are, there will be little teams of troops with a few anti-tank weapons and a fire team or two every few kilometers, making any advance slow, dangerous, and nerve-wracking. And it really does seem as if the Russian nerve is breaking first, as a lot of their soldiers appear to be contract or conscript soldiers. These will have a relative minimum of training, and many of them seem to have thought they weren't going to war at all. Bearing in mind it's impossible to verify many of the clips currently circulating, but we have seen several videos, supposedly of Russian POWs, saying they were de facto tricked, having been told they were just going on training maneuvers rather than a full-blown invasion, not realizing that this was the real McCoy before the bullets started spanking off the sides of their BMPs. Meanwhile, Ukrainian morale seems sky high. After the first day of fighting, the Russians appear to have made very little headway anywhere besides out of Crimea, a fact that will undoubtedly further bolster Ukrainian morale and weaken Russian morale. And morale is absolutely still a deciding factor in warfare. This is a fact that has not changed since we first started bonking one another with sticks and stones. We can also see the effect on the civilian population, with several reports indicating that a lot of Ukrainian civilians are willing and able to pick up weapons and do their part to fight alongside the regular army against the Russian invaders. There are also a great deal of reports of the Russians themselves being, well, in a way, kind of horrified of this. There was one message that was supposedly released recently, but released by the Ukrainians, so take it with a grain of salt there, from a Russian soldier saying that he found it very difficult to be invading Ukraine because he had been told that they would be welcomed as liberators. They were coming to denazify the country, apparently, and yet now they were being shouted at and denounced as aggressors. That is going to do quite the number on an army, particularly when you're invading a neighboring country sharing a great deal of your own ethnicity, traditions, and part of the language too. And this leads us neatly to the third point, logistics. The Russian army has been suffering from logistical challenges for over a solid decade now at least. During their invasion of Georgia in 2008, everything that could go wrong logistically did go wrong. Endless columns of Russian trucks and armor piled up in massive traffic jams with communication and fuel problems rampant. And that was in the face of next to no opposition. The same and worse is happening in Ukraine, with tremendous columns of vehicles not going anywhere, it seems, and tons of clips of videos showing Russian vehicles out of gas or straight up abandoned due to, presumably, lack of fuel or spare parts, or possibly even straight up desertions. It is difficult to say. This is obviously not good news for the front lines, as they might not be getting supplies that they need to continue fighting, and even worse, the traffic jams and need to bring up bullets and fuel first will undoubtedly be delaying Russian reinforcements that have been trickling in day by day. By the last estimate I've seen, the majority of the Russian army at the border is now dedicated in one way or another. Presumably, Russian planners had intended to get around a lot of the logistical problems by dividing the advance into several attack columns, meaning that they could spread all of their resources over a much larger geographical area rather than trying to cram 250,000 men down a single highway, which would obviously lead to disaster. I've been seeing a lot of mentions that the Russian army is spread too thin right now, but that is a consequence of Ukrainian resistance rather than necessarily an error in planning, as it was very clearly intended from the general movements of the Russian columns that they would push into Ukraine from multiple directions, allowing them to use more of their army without congesting the roads, and then join up, rapidly defeating pockets of Ukrainian resistance. It's a tactic that would be very recognizable to World War II generals, really. The problem is, these columns haven't been able to make that push through, which can very potentially leave them stretched out and dangerously exposed without being able to support one another, particularly as we have seen very little, if almost any, pictures of destroyed Ukrainian tanks. There are reports suggesting that the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian armor and most of their good mechanized infantry, beyond some rapid response brigades, are all kept in reserve, which is a possibility that as a Russian commander I would be very worried about, as if these somehow manage to make it to the root of some of these long assault columns, you could very easily end up being the encircled rather than the encircler. Not to mention, of course, the potential threat to the supply trains and the logistics themselves. There is also a lot of footage seemingly suggesting Ukrainian drone and even airstrikes on these logistical columns. I've seen quite a few of this. I'm not going to show it here because I cannot verify that at all. I have seen so many of them turn out to be from Syria or other places. But the Ukrainian army does have drones, though considering the advanced nature of Russian AA and AAA, I'm surprised if they turn out to have been as effective as it seems they have. I've even seen one footage appearing to show a drone taking out a pair of Buk AAA launchers. That should not be happening. But before I waffle on for too long, I'll begin wrapping it up there. I just want to say that right now we know very little, really know very little. For all we know, the Russians could be doing far better than it appears. Ukrainian armored columns might be burning all across the country, and resistance might literally collapse tomorrow. Simultaneously, it could be way worse for the Russians than it appears as well. The fog of war is a real thing. I also want to end by saying that I am, of course, not by any extent of the imagination a military professional. These are merely my semi-educated guesses after a life spent with a fairly burning passion for all things military and historical. I would myself consider myself to have a reasonable grasp on strategic matters, but take this for what it is, my barely educated guesses based on probably heavily flawed and very unclear information. And finally, I also want to ask my subscribers here how you feel about this kind of content. Do you want me to potentially do more of it? I'm not going to be spamming this out because I see no reason to. I'm only going to be doing them if I'm going to be doing them at all, if I think I have something valuable to add. But if you would much rather see just more generalized entertainment stuff, I'll totally understand that as well. So please do give me some ideas of your feedback here. I'd very much so appreciate it. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.